The text came through at 7:42 on a Saturday evening, right in the middle of my son-in-law's toast, and it said 5 words. Is the porch light on? Nobody else at that party knew what those 5 words meant. To everyone standing around that rented tent with a glass of champagne in their hand, it looked like a daughter checking in with her father about nothing at all. But I felt my whole body go still. The way it used to go still 30 years ago when a radio call came through that sounded routine but wasn't. I set my drink down on the closest table without looking at it. I smiled at the man next to me like I hadn't just felt the floor tilt under my boots. And I thought, not for the first time that summer, that my son-in-law had no idea who he'd spent 7 years quietly humiliating. He was 3 sentences into a toast about family and legacy, using my daughter's hand as a prop, when I read that message. And I already knew, before I even looked up, that in about 10 minutes, I was going to have to become a man I hadn't been in a very long time. My name is Frank Whitmore. I spent 30 years in the United States Army, and I retired holding the rank of Command Sergeant Major. I served in places I still don't talk about at dinner tables, and I spent the last 8 years of my career, and a good number of years after that as a volunteer, working fraud cases that targeted military families. My son-in-law, Derek Cole, knew almost none of this. As far as he was concerned, I was Emily's quiet old dad who used to be in the Army, or something. A man who fixed his own gutters and didn't say much at parties. He'd made a few jokes over the years about what exactly a man like me could have possibly done in uniform for 3 decades. I let him believe whatever was easiest for him to believe. That turned out to be the most useful thing I ever did for my family, and also, eventually, the thing that broke this whole business wide open. But to understand why my daughter would text me a code phrase from a wedding anniversary party, instead of just walking over and whispering in my ear, you have to go back further than that toast. You have to go back to the day I came home for good. I retired from active duty when Emily was 12 years old. She'd grown up mostly with her mother, Margaret, doing the raising while I was gone for months at a stretch, sometimes longer. Maggie used to say that our daughter learned to read a room before she learned to read a book, because she'd had to. She knew what it meant when I called home, and my voice sounded a certain kind of careful. She knew how to be brave for her mother when the news was bad somewhere in the world, and she didn't know yet whether it touched us. When I finally hung up my uniform, I made her a promise. I told her that from then on, if she was ever scared, or trapped, or in a room where she couldn't say what she needed to say out loud, all she had to do was ask me one ordinary-sounding question, and I would come, no explanation required. We picked something boring on purpose, nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would ever notice in a text message. Is the porch light on? That was it. I'd learned, in my line of work later on, that the best signals are the ones that look like nothing at all. She was 12 when we made that deal. She was 34 when she finally had to use it for real, in front of 120 wedding guests, a string quartet, and her husband mid-sentence. Derek came into our lives about 7 years before that night. Emily brought him home for Thanksgiving, nervous in the particular way she got nervous when something mattered to her. I liked him well enough at first. He had a story he was proud of, and it was, to be fair, a genuinely good one. He'd grown up with nothing in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, put himself through a state college, doing sales jobs nobody wanted, and clawed his way into the financial services world on nothing but charm and hustle. He was good with people. He was, and I want to be fair about this because it matters, wonderful with my grandkids. He got down on the carpet and built block towers with them, for an hour at a stretch. He remembered their teachers' names. He showed up to school plays with a video camera and cried, actually cried, at his daughter's kindergarten graduation. There was a real person in there, underneath everything that came later. I want that on the record, because it's easy to make a villain into a cartoon, and Derek Cole was never a cartoon. He was a man who wanted, badly, to be somebody important, and he'd built a whole identity on the idea that he'd earned everything himself, with nobody's help. somewhere in there, that need curdled into something else. Maggie liked him too, in those early years. More than I did, if I'm being honest. She used to tell me I was too quiet with him, too watchful. The same way I'd been watchful with every young man who ever came around our daughter. Give him a chance to know you, Frank, she'd say. Not everybody grows up around men like you. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. She passed 4 years into their marriage, quick and quiet, the kind of illness that doesn't give a family much runway to prepare. Derek gave a genuinely kind eulogy at her funeral, one that made me think, for a while afterward, that Maggie had been right about him all along. I held on to that eulogy for a long time, the way you hold on to proof that you haven't misjudged somebody. It made what came later harder to see clearly, at first, and harder still to accept, once I finally did. The first sign of what Derek actually thought of me came about a year into the marriage, at a dinner at their house. Someone had asked me, politely, what I'd done in the army. Before I could even answer, Derek laughed and said, "Frank probably guarded a warehouse somewhere, didn't you, Frank?" It wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was careless. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He simply couldn't imagine that a quiet, gray-haired man who fixed his own truck and never raised his voice could have been anything remarkable. I told him I'd done some logistics work, some paperwork, and let the table move on to other things. Emily shot me a look across the table that night. She knew what logistics work was, doing all that heavy lifting. She didn't say anything either. Neither of us did. That was our mistake, if you want to call it that, though I'm not sure I'd take it back even now. The second time, it wasn't so gentle. This was maybe 2 years into the marriage, at Derek's father's retirement party of all places. Derek stood up to toast his own father, a man who'd worked 31 years for the same manufacturing company. And in the middle of that toast, he said something like, "Dad, you're the kind of man who actually built something real with his life." Not everybody can say that. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. Emily's hand found mine under the table. I squeezed it back and said nothing because that is what you learn to do, over 30 years of service, when the fight in front of you isn't the fight that matters. The third incident is the one I still think about the most, because it's the one where I watched my daughter get smaller, in a room full of people who loved her. It was a 4th of July barbecue at our house, my house, the one Maggie and I bought back in 1994, the one I'd built the back deck on with my own 2 hands the summer after I came home from my last deployment. Derek had invited some of his business associates, people I'd never met, men in polo shirts holding beers they weren't really drinking, the kind of men who talk with their whole bodies. At some point, Derek clinked his glass with a pen he still had clipped to his shirt pocket from work, the same pen he used to sign investor paperwork, and gave a toast. "To family," he said, raising his beer high, pointing that pen in a slow circle around the yard, touching on his father, his business associates, even a neighbor's dog, before letting it drift past me without ever quite landing. "To the Coles. To always taking care of our own." He said it 4 times over the course of about 2 minutes. Family, our own, taking care, circling around and around a warmth that never once landed on me, standing 6 feet away from him holding 2 hot dogs I was about to bring over to my grandkids. He never said my name, not once. That pen kept tracing its slow, friendly circle through the whole toast, touching every face in that yard but mine. Like a searchlight with one blind spot built in on purpose. 120 seconds of a man performing gratitude for everyone in the yard, except the one person whose deck he was standing on. I remember exactly how the paper plate felt in my hand, going soft and warm from the heat of the hot dogs, and I remember thinking, this is the strangest kind of lonely a man can feel, surrounded by his own family in his own backyard. Emily found me in the kitchen a few minutes later, refilling a bowl of chips that didn't need refilling. "Dad," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. He doesn't mean anything by it." I told her it was fine. I want to tell you I believed that when I said it. I didn't, not entirely. But I also understood something that I don't think Emily fully understood yet, herself. Derek wasn't just careless about me. He was building something, piece by piece. A story about himself as a self-made man, surrounded by people who'd never accomplished what he'd accomplished. And in that story there was no room for a quiet old soldier who might have outranked him in every way that actually mattered. I didn't know yet how literally that would turn out to be true. There was a fourth incident, smaller than the others in some ways, though it stung longer than any of them. When Derek and Emily planned a vow renewal for their 5th anniversary, a modest thing at the time, just family and a backyard and a borrowed arch, Derek quietly handled the guest list and the small ceremonial details himself, the way a groom sometimes likes to feel useful. He asked his own father to say a few words. He asked his business partner, a younger man named Ronnie Castellan, to stand up beside him as a kind of honorary best man for the occasion. He never once thought to ask me if I wanted to say anything, walk anyone anywhere, or even stand near the front. I ended up in the second row, between 2 of Derek's cousins I'd met exactly once, watching my own daughter renew vows to a man who hadn't found 5 minutes to ask her father if he wanted a part in the day. Emily noticed after the fact, and apologized quietly in the kitchen that night. The same kitchen, the same quiet apology, becoming something of a pattern between us that I didn't like at all. The real trouble started about 8 months before that anniversary party, when Derek launched something he called the Patriot Legacy Fund. He came to Emily and me together, at our kitchen table, with a slideshow on his laptop, and a level of polish that told me he'd given this pitch before. He talked about exclusive access and guaranteed annual returns and giving back to military families like ours. He used the word "our" a lot that night, which struck me even then, because it was the first time in 7 years he'd ever claimed any closeness to my service at all, except now that my service might be useful to him as a selling point. He wanted Emily to invest her savings. He wanted me to invest mine, my whole pension cushion, the money Maggie and I had built over 3 decades, so I wouldn't be a burden on my daughter when I got old and slow. He framed it as an opportunity I'd be foolish to pass up. He framed my hesitation, gently but unmistakably, as the caution of a man who didn't understand modern finance. "No offense, Frank," he said, "but this isn't the Army. Things move faster out here." I told him I needed time to think about it. That was true. What I didn't tell him was that something in his pitch had already set off an alarm bell I hadn't heard ring in years. One built from 8 years working Army Criminal Investigation Division financial crimes cases, and another decade after that volunteering, with a task force that helped military families spot exactly this kind of thing. He used the phrase "guaranteed returns." He used the phrase "exclusive to our military family." He promised numbers that didn't wobble with the market, ever, in any economy. Every single one of those phrases is printed, word for word in the Investor, alerts the Securities and Exchange Commission and FINRA put out warning veterans and their families about something called affinity fraud, which is what regulators call it when a con artist uses a shared identity, a church, a unit, a community, sometimes even a family, to lower people's guard long enough to take their money. I'd seen this exact script run on soldiers' widows 20 years earlier. I was looking at it again, from a man who called himself family, at my own kitchen table. I didn't say any of that to Derek that night. I said I'd think about it. Emily, God love her, believed in her husband, and she believed I was being stubborn and old-fashioned. And honestly, I let her believe that too, for a while, because I didn't yet have proof of anything, only instinct. And instinct isn't something you can hand your daughter as evidence against the man she married. Over the following months, I watched quietly. I asked Emily, in what I hoped were casual conversations, how the fund was doing, who else had invested, what the paperwork looked like. She showed me some of it, not suspicious of my asking, just glad her old dad was finally taking an interest in something modern. What I saw in those documents confirmed what my gut had already told me. There was no registration with the State Securities Division. There was no prospectus that would survive an afternoon with a real regulator. There were glossy one-page summaries promising numbers that any honest financial advisor would have laughed out of the room. And there were, tucked in the fine print, references to military-affiliated founding partners, language clearly meant to imply a connection to actual veterans that Derek had never earned and, as far as I could tell, had never asked my permission to use. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and more dangerous than anger. I went out to the garage that night and pulled down a small oak box from the top shelf. A box Maggie had given me for our 20th anniversary. The one where I kept my discharge papers, my old photographs, a couple of medals I never talked about, and a folder of names and numbers from my SID years that I'd kept, technically against every instinct of a tidy retirement, just in case a man like me is ever useful again. I sat at my workbench for a long time that night looking through it, at a photograph of my old unit, at the citation for the Bronze Star I'd never once mentioned to my son-in-law, and I thought about what it would mean to finally use all of it. I didn't do anything rash. I want to be clear about that. Because the temptation, when you find out someone is hurting the people you love, is to walk into their house and start throwing furniture. That's not how 30 years in uniform teaches you to fight. It teaches you to gather everything first, quietly, and to choose your moment. So I made some calls. I still had a contact from my old task force days, a woman named Carol Reyes who now worked investigations for the State Securities Division. The kind of office most people don't even know exists until they need it badly. I brought her copies of everything Emily had shown me, the marketing materials, the unregistered offering documents, the guaranteed return language. Carol confirmed within a week what I already suspected. The Patriot Legacy Fund had never been registered as a security in this state, which is required by law before you can legally sell shares of an investment to the public. Promising guaranteed returns on an investment, with no variation no matter what the market does, is one of the oldest red flags in the book, because no legitimate investment can honestly promise that. And selling unregistered securities while misrepresenting a military affiliation you don't actually have isn't just bad business practice. It's a felony, plain and simple. The same kind of felony that put men I'd once investigated behind bars for a decade or more. Carol's office opened a formal inquiry. That takes time, and it takes patience. 2 things 30 years of service teaches a man in abundance. She walked me through, patiently, exactly what her team needed before they could act. A tip alone isn't enough. Investigators need documentation, a pattern, corroborating detail that holds up, because the moment a state agency moves on a case like this, the target usually knows within days, and any evidence not already secured tends to disappear along with the money. So I did what I'd been trained to do a lifetime ago. I built a file. I asked Emily, gently and without ever telling her why, to keep sending me copies of anything Derek shared with investors, quarterly statements, new marketing decks, emails where he described the fund to prospective clients. I cross-referenced the promised return rates against actual market performance for the same months and found, exactly as I expected, numbers that never once dipped, even when the broader market had a rough quarter, a mathematical impossibility for any fund actually invested in anything real. I logged dates. I kept a simple paper timeline, the same kind of timeline I used to build for a court-martial, because evidence that isn't organized is just noise, no matter how damning it looks in your gut. I sat on what I knew for nearly 2 months, watching my son-in-law recruit more investors, watching my daughter grow more stressed by the week as the fund's early returns started needing new investor money to keep paying out to the old investors, which is exactly how a fraud like this always eventually runs out of road. Carol called me twice during those 2 months, with updates I could tell she was giving me more generously than her job technically required, one investigator to another, in a manner of speaking. The second call was the one that told me the freeze order was drafted and ready, waiting only for the right trigger to file it, because filing too early, before enough investors were named and enough money was traceable, could let Derek simply argue it away as a misunderstanding and quietly wind the whole thing down before real harm could be proven. We needed one more piece. We needed him, in public, in front of witnesses, making the exact claims the whole case turned on. I didn't know yet that he was about to hand me that piece himself, wrapped up in a wedding anniversary toast. 3 weeks before that anniversary party, I found out just how close to the edge it had gotten. Emily called me late one night, her voice small in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager. Derek wanted her to refinance their house, pull the equity out, and put it into the fund to cover a shortfall before a big investor showcase he had planned. He'd told her it was temporary. He'd told her the anniversary party, the one they were already planning, could double as that showcase. A chance to bring real investors into their home, feel the warmth of a real family, and open their wallets with confidence. He wanted Emily to stand up in front of those investors and say, publicly, that her own father, the veteran, was fully invested and fully behind the fund. He wanted to use my name and my service, the service he'd mocked for years, as the final piece of proof that closed the deal. That was the night I understood something with total clarity, the kind of clarity I used to only get in the field, right before something happened. Derek didn't just disrespect my service. He had built his entire fraud on the idea that it could eventually be useful to him, that a quiet old soldier's credibility could be borrowed without permission the moment it served his purposes, the same way he'd borrow anything else that wasn't nailed down. My silence, the very thing that let him underestimate me for 7 years, was about to become the bait in his final pitch. I told Emily to trust me, that I had a plan, and that if things ever felt wrong at that party, all she had to do was send me our old signal, and I would come. The night of the anniversary party arrived warm and clear, string lights strung across the backyard, a rented tent, a jazz trio Derek had hired to make the whole thing feel effortless and expensive. About 40 of the guests were family and old friends. The other 80 were investors, current and prospective, men and women Derek had spent months courting, several of them, I later learned, veterans themselves or the widows of veterans. Exactly the community affinity fraud is built to exploit. I arrived early, in my good gray suit, the oak box sitting quiet and heavy in a canvas bag by my feet under the gift table. I'd told Emily only that I'd have something with me, nothing more, because I didn't want to put the burden of that secret on her, on top of everything else she was already carrying. For the first hour, it was, I'll admit, a lovely party. String lights caught the early evening light just right, the jazz trio played something low and easy, and my grandkids ran barefoot across the lawn, chasing each other in circles, the way kids do at parties that are really for the adults. Derek was in his element, working the tent like a man born to it, introducing his in-laws with genuine warmth, and his investors with a slightly different kind of warmth, the kind with a hook buried in it. I watched him laugh with an elderly man in a Navy veteran's cap, watched him put a hand on the man's shoulder and say something that made the old sailor beam, and I understood, watching that, exactly how good Derek actually was at what he did. That's the part that should scare people most about fraud like this. It rarely comes wearing a mustache and a bad suit. It comes with a genuine laugh and a hand on your shoulder at your granddaughter's dance recital. I made my own quiet rounds, shaking hands, accepting compliments on the weather and the flowers, all the while cataloging faces the way I used to catalog faces in a market square overseas, not out of any real suspicion of danger, just old habit, noting who Derek spent the most time with, who he steered gently away from the bar and toward a quiet corner of the tent for a private word. I counted at least 6 conversations like that in the first half hour alone. Every one of them ended with Derek reaching into his jacket for a business card, and every one of them ended with the other party nodding slowly, the particular nod of someone doing math, about how much they could comfortably wire on Monday morning. About 45 minutes in, I noticed Emily disappear toward the house, and Derek follow a minute later, his easy smile gone the moment he thought no one was watching. I didn't chase them. I've learned, in this life, that chasing a moment before it's ready only spoils it. I stood near the bar with a club soda and waited. She told me later exactly what happened in that kitchen. Derek had pulled her aside because one of his biggest investors, a retired Marine colonel who'd put in nearly $200,000, had started asking pointed questions about why his last quarterly statement hadn't arrived. Derek needed Emily, right then in the middle of her own anniversary party, to go find the colonel and personally reassure him, using her father's name, that everything was solid, that her dad, the command sergeant major, was fully behind the fund and always had been. When Emily hesitated, unsure how to lie to a man in a room full of people she respected, Derek's voice dropped into a register she'd never quite heard from him before, tight and cold, telling her this wasn't the moment to get squeamish, that the whole night, the house, everything, depended on her doing this one simple thing for him. He gripped her arm, not violently, but hard enough, urgently enough, that she felt something close to real fear for the first time in her marriage. She excused herself to the bathroom, locked the door, and typed 5 words into her phone with shaking hands. "Is the porch light on?" I felt that phone buzz in my jacket pocket while Derek was 3 sentences into his big toast to the tent. The same toast where he'd start, I'd learn, by praising family and legacy before pivoting, smooth as anything, into thanking his founding investors for believing in the vision of the Patriot Legacy Fund. I read those 5 words, set my glass down, and did not hurry, because hurrying is the first thing that gives a man away. I want to tell you about the paragraph of thought that went through my head in that moment, because I've turned it over many times since. I realized, standing in that tent with string lights overhead, that everything Derek had ever said about me, every joke about warehouses, every toast that skipped my name, every quiet little humiliation over 7 years, hadn't just been thoughtless. It had been training. He had spent 7 years teaching an entire room of people, our whole extended family, exactly how little I mattered, so that on this one specific night, when he needed my name to close a room full of strangers, nobody would question why the quiet old man suddenly had something to say. He had built the box I was about to step out of. I hadn't fully understood, until that exact second, standing under those lights, just how deliberately he had built it. I walked into the house and found Emily still gripping the bathroom doorframe. Her face pale, Derek nowhere in sight, gone back out to keep the toast rolling while he waited for her to deliver his lie. I didn't ask her a single question. I just put my hand on her shoulder, the way I used to before a hard conversation with a young soldier who needed steadying, and I said, "It's all right. Come stand next to me. Let me handle this one." We walked back out together, and I picked up the canvas bag from under the gift table on the way. Derek was just finishing, glass raised, saying something about how family meant standing behind the people who believe in you, when I stepped up beside him, set the oak box down on the head table in front of 120 guests, and asked, quietly but clearly enough to carry, if I could say a few words. He hesitated for half a second, that same easy smile flickering, before waving me on with a generous little gesture, the gracious host letting his sweet old father-in-law have his moment. He had no idea what was in the box. I opened it slowly. I lifted out my discharge papers first, then a small velvet case, and set it open on the table where the light caught the metal inside. I told that room, calmly, the way I'd once briefed commanding officers on operations that mattered, that my name is Frank Whitmore, that I served 30 years in the United States Army, that I retired as a command sergeant major, and that the last 8 years of that career, along with the decade of volunteer work after it, were spent investigating financial fraud that specifically targeted military families. I let that last part breathe for a moment before I said anything else, because I wanted every investor in that tent to understand exactly what kind of man was now holding the floor. Then I told them about the Patriot Legacy Fund. I let that sink in for a beat before I went further, watching a few faces around the tent shift from polite confusion into something more alert. I told them, plainly, that it had never been registered with the state as required by law before anyone sells an investment to the public. That fact alone drew a low murmur from a cluster of investors near the back. The kind of murmur that tells you people are quietly recalculating everything they thought they knew about their own money. I told them next that a promise of guaranteed returns, with no variation no matter what the market does, is one of the oldest tricks in the fraud playbook, because no honest investment can promise that, ever. Not in 30 years of watching markets rise and fall, have I ever seen an honest fund that didn't have at least one rough quarter to show for it. I paused again there, letting that land on its own before moving to the next piece, because throwing every fact at a crowd all at once is how you lose them. You give people one true thing, let them feel its weight, then hand them the next. I told them, in the simplest language I could find, that selling an unregistered investment while implying a military affiliation that was never earned isn't a gray area or a rookie mistake. It's a felony called securities fraud, the same charge that has put men I once helped investigate behind bars for years. I said that sentence slowly, because I wanted every person holding a drink in that tent to understand it wasn't a figure of speech. Finally, I told them that I had reviewed the fund's documents myself, recognized the exact language regulators warn about in their public investor alerts about affinity fraud, the same warnings I used to hand out to young families on bases 20 years earlier, and passed everything to the State Securities Division nearly 2 months before that night. I told them, gently, that a formal inquiry was already underway, that a freeze order was ready to be filed, and that anyone in that tent who had invested should expect a call from an investigator within the coming days. The Marine colonel who'd been asking questions all night went very quiet, and then very red in the face, though not, I want to be clear, at me. Derek's smile had not so much fallen as evaporated, replaced by the look of a man doing frantic math in real time, trying to find some angle. Some charm, some sentence that could undo what 120 people had just heard with their own ears. He started to say my name, started to say Frank. Come on, this isn't the place. And I looked at him, not with rage, because rage was never the right tool for this job, but with the same flat, patient calm I used to use on men who'd lied to my face in an interrogation room. You made it the place, I told him, the moment you decided to use my daughter and my name to sell it. I didn't need to say much more than that. Within the week, the state's formal freeze order had gone through, halting any further movement of investor funds while the investigation proceeded, exactly the kind of protective step that regulators are able to take once a credible fraud referral lands on their desk with real documentation behind it. The colonel and several other investors, forewarned that night, never wired the additional funds Derek had been counting on to keep the whole structure limping along for one more quarter. Within 2 months, Derek Cole was formally charged with securities fraud at the state level, with federal charges under review given the scale of what investigators eventually found once they opened his books all the way. Ronnie Castellan, the same business partner who'd once stood up beside Derek at that vow renewal instead of me, cooperated with investigators once the freeze order landed, handing over emails that made clear he'd known from the start there was no real fund behind the fund, only new investor money paying off old investor promises. Ronnie's cooperation earned him a lighter charge and a plea deal, along with a court-ordered restitution schedule that will follow him for years, a fact he apparently didn't appreciate fully until the judge read it aloud. Derek, who insisted to the very end that he'd simply been a passionate entrepreneur who'd made some paperwork mistakes, did not get the same mercy from a jury that heard. In plain terms, Exactly how many retirees and veterans' widows had handed over their savings to a man who'd borrowed their trust the same way he'd borrowed mine. The Marine colonel who'd gone red in the face that night turned out to be one of the case's most valuable witnesses, once he got over the sting of nearly losing $200,000. He'd kept meticulous copies of every statement Derek ever sent him, out of an old habit from his own years handling unit finances, and those records became some of the clearest documentation prosecutors had. He got the bulk of his investment back through the court-ordered asset recovery, though not all of it, and he told me once, over coffee some months later, that the money mattered less to him than the fact that nobody had listened to his quarterly statement question until an old sergeant major finally stood up and said it out loud for him. The elderly Navy veteran in the cap, the one Derek had charmed so easily that night, had only put in $10,000 so far, a small mercy of timing, and got every dollar of it back within the year. Later that night, after the tent had emptied and the caterers had folded the last table, Emily and I sat together on the back steps of the house. The same steps she'd sat on as a girl, waiting for my truck to come up the driveway after a long deployment. She didn't ask me right away why I'd never told her the full extent of what was in that oak box. She just leaned her head against my shoulder the way she used to, and we sat there a long while, listening to the crickets take over where the jazz trio had left off. Finally, she asked, quietly, how long I'd known. I told her the truth, that I'd suspected something was wrong almost from the first pitch at our kitchen table, and that I'd spent 2 months building a case instead of a confrontation, because I needed proof strong enough that no one, including her, could talk themselves out of believing it. She cried for a while then, not for Derek, she told me later, but for the version of the last 7 years where she might have trusted her own instincts sooner, instead of assuming her father simply didn't understand modern finance. I told her there was nothing to forgive herself for. Some men are very good at making you doubt exactly the people who love you best. That was never her fault, and it was never mine either. It was only ever his. Emily filed for divorce 11 days after that party. I won't pretend that was an easy stretch of months for her, and I won't pretend I didn't feel the particular guilt of a father who'd known things his daughter didn't, for longer than he probably should have stayed quiet. But she has told me, more than once since, that the hardest part was never learning what her husband had done. It was realizing how much smaller he had needed her father to be, for years, in order to feel big himself. She kept the house, thanks in part to a very simple legal fact her divorce attorney was delighted to explain to her, that Derek's business assets, being the direct product of the fraud, were the first thing the courts and the state clawed back to make his victims whole, not the family home she and the kids still needed. I still have that oak box. It sits on the same shelf in the garage it always did, though these days I take it down more often, mostly so my grandkids can hold the Bronze Star and ask me questions I finally feel ready to answer. My grandson, who's 8 now, likes to line up my old unit photographs on the workbench and ask me to name every man in them, and I do, one by one, even the ones who never made it home, because a boy that age should grow up, knowing that quiet men carry whole histories nobody ever bothered to ask about. Emily asked me once, not long after the divorce was final, why I never told Derek any of it in 7 years. Why I let him believe I'd spent 30 years filing paperwork in a warehouse somewhere. I told her the truth. The men I served with who actually earned the medals in that box rarely talked about them either. Explaining yourself to someone who's already decided not to respect you was never going to change his mind. It was only ever going to give him a new way to use me. I was never ashamed of my service. I was simply saving it for the one moment it might actually matter, and I am glad. More than I can easily say, that when that moment came, it was in service of my daughter and not his sales pitch. These days, the porch light out front stays on most evenings, same as it always did, no code required. Just an old habit of a house that likes to be found in the dark. Emily and the kids come by most Sundays now. Derek is serving his sentence upstate, And I understand there's a wing of that facility where a man's charm doesn't count for nearly as much as it used to on the outside. If there's one thing 30 years in uniform and a lifetime chasing fraud ever taught me, it's this. Real strength has never needed to announce itself in a toast, or a joke at someone else's expense, or a slideshow promising numbers too good to be honest. It just waits, quiet and ready, for the moment somebody you love needs it. The men and women I served beside understood that better than almost anyone I've ever met. I hope, wherever they are tonight, they'd be proud of how their old friend Frank finally put that particular lesson to use. So let me ask you this. If someone you loved had spent years quietly making you feel small in your own family, would you have said something the first time it happened? Or would you have waited, the way I did, for the moment it actually mattered? I'd genuinely like to know, and if you've got a story of your own like this one, tell me your age when you write it, because I read every single one of them. Before you go, there's a woman 2 streets over from where I grew up, named Colonel Ruth Aldenberg, retired Army Nurse Corps, 32 years of service, who called me last month in a state I'd never heard from her before. Her son-in-law had quietly filed paperwork with a lawyer trying to have her declared incompetent, all so he could take control of her VA survivor benefits and her power of attorney before she even knew a hearing had been scheduled. She only found out by accident when a court notice arrived at the wrong address and a kind clerk called to double-check her mailing information. Ruth spent 32 years making life-or-death decisions in field hospitals under fire. Nobody was about to quietly decide, on a piece of paper she'd never seen, that she couldn't make decisions about her own life anymore. That story is coming next, and I promise you, Ruth does not go down without one of the most satisfying fights I've ever had the privilege of hearing about first.